I was so happy to see the chapter that opened up in this book today, Ecclesiastes chapter 3. It's been a while since we jumped in to take a look at the works of Solomon. Very interesting person. And Jesus actually makes reference to Solomon in laying some claim for his own life as being the greatest example since Solomon of a life of wisdom. So, for people who come from a Christian background, looking at this, let's understand that the one person who was greater than Solomon in the respect to wisdom or how to live a good life was Jesus. So here we're looking at the second best person, at least within the Jewish and Christian context, to learn from about what is good to do during our short time on the earth. And let's just say what was the preacher's intention. Let's see. He turned himself to consider wisdom, madness, and folly. Not a lot of us have had the chance to do so to quite the extent that Solomon has. We are jumping in on chapter 3, a time for everything, and I'm guessing, given the writer that this guy was, it's significant that we're looking at the third chapter in contrast with the 12th. So we're still here in the beginning quarter, the last of the first section. And interesting enough, we have this whole poetic section which opens this part. So just to understand where we are, here's a little outline that's given to us by the publishers of this particular book. We have the introduction, the vanities, they say of the natural world of wisdom and knowledge, pleasure, possession, wisdom, labor. So basically, this guy opens the book saying, vanity of vanities, says the preacher, how he identifies himself. Vanity of vanities, all is vanity, and as we know, vain means to be empty, obsessed with itself, but having no substance. And we get through chapter 1, which is talking about that. So 1 is poetic, 2 is the story of the author. I think this is a really great way of now establishing his credibility as a speaker. And then we move up to chapter 3, where we have this, again, poetic, what appears to be an introduction to a poetic section. And here use the theme, a time to be, a time to be, a time to do, a time to, all of these things. And we'll take a look at that a little bit. But he introduces it. For everything there is a season and a time for every matter under heaven. Unsurprisingly, it's time to go back to the book of Genesis because he's talking about times and seasons under heaven, and I think it's important that we remember Solomon knew something that is written down in Genesis chapter 1, and I think it would also be wise for us to remember this. For everything there is a time and a season, and there are particular times and seasons. Let's see. Genesis chapter 1, verse 14. And God said, let there be lights in the expanse of the heavens to separate the day from the night times, and let them be for signs and for seasons. Does anybody recognize this word? Again, if we're thinking seasons, right? Here's the word. I'd love to dive into the Hebrew, and if any of you Hebrew scholars out there see a difference between this word season and this word season, let me know. But I see this connection here because the purpose of these lights in the sky, the stars, the planets, is for times and seasons. And today we are incredibly out of touch with what's happening in the heavens. And like this introduction is basically saying, go look at the governors of times and seasons to see what it is time for. There is a time for being born, for dying, for planting, to pluck up what is planted. We understand these fairly well. Is there really a time to kill and a time to heal? A time to break down and a time to build up? Cycles, cycles, so many cycles. A time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance, a time to cast away stones and a time to gather stones together. Now, in our Western way of thinking, ever since the days of the Greek philosophers, so about 2,500 years ago, humans with a European and largely Western civilization now way of thinking have viewed time in a linear fashion. We say there is a beginning and an end, a time to be born and a time to die. We miss out on the rest of the cycle in that planting and plucking up happens every year. Killing and healing happens. I don't know when. I would rather this didn't happen at all. Breaking down and building up. This is a natural cycle. It's reflected a whole lot more in your Eastern traditions, and particularly in those safeguarded by the Hindu culture. They have a value for breaking down and building up, a value for weeping and laughing. It's this balance, a time to seek and a time to lose, a time to keep and a time to cast away, a time to tear and a time to sow, a time to keep silence and a time to speak, a time to love and a time to hate, a time for war and a time for peace. Very interesting. One of these does not belong. Two of them, actually. If we look at the first and the second, what's the relationship between the first and the second part that Solomon has here? We have birth, which we view as positive, death, which we view as negative, plant, pluck up. Both of these tend to be positive. Negative, 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 positive, positive, positive. What do we think? The tear is negative. War is negative. So we have these interrelationships, and I think we could probably spend a lot of time in here looking at how the author chose to group things. Interesting, put love and hate opposite one another. There is a time for both of these. There's a season for both of these. Tearing and sowing, both essential parts. You have to cut before you can sow. Seeking and losing. So overall, on a surface level, what I'm impressed with is the cyclical nature of life and the appreciation of what we look at as being opposites. And this is so key to my work that I'm actually going to save this section under this word polarity. Because under heaven, at least in the three-dimensional world that we live in, the material world expresses truth in terms of opposites and polarities, this idea of good and evil. This has been the defining point of the human story since Genesis chapter 3, when Adam and Eve ate from the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. In other words, opposites. And their reaction to having both of these things was to begin to judge one as good and to judge the other as evil. But Solomon comes in and he's not one saying, being born is good, dying is bad, planting is good, plucking up is bad, killing is good, healing is bad, or the other way around. He's saying, for everything there is a season and a time for every matter under heaven. And to what? How do we determine? How do we decide? How do we know? I'd pointed us to Genesis chapter 1 and said, hey, the stars and the planets can give us some idea. And those of you who are into the weird science of astrology know that there are currently 6 planets that are moving in reverse as far as they're perceived from Earth, which for those who follow that and think there's something to it is interesting, because when you look to the sky and see what's happening, as did the wise men who came to see Jesus at his birth, as did Daniel, who was one of the chief consultants for King Nebuchadnezzar, counted among the astrologers and magicians, and who likely is the one who set up the wise men of many generations later to identify the signs in the sky that said Messiah had been born. So the point of my reading this is not to prove the legitimacy or question the legitimacy of astrology, simply to point out that there are some interesting things that have been maintained in that practice that are recognized in the Bible, even though we can also look a little bit more at the commands to the Old Testament Jewish people are that they are not to rely upon the magicians or the readers of signs or people who attempted to cross over the world, because they had access to God himself. And why, when you have access to God himself, would you be looking to other things? I would suggest that because sometimes there are tools in the world, like education, like videos, like this one, like pencils, like books, like words, that help us to hear more clearly. So let's not look away from our understanding of seasons and times from those things that have been set up to communicate something about seasons and times. And as we see from here, seasons and times are not just about planting and harvesting, not just about day and night. They're about the cycles of every part of life. I want to stay here in meditation just a little bit longer because I'm recognizing a grouping that I made a while back when I read. I'm kind of curious. 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 10, 11, 12, 13. There's 14. It's no relevance to the chapters. Anyway, forgive the live study nature of this. It's always very interesting to simply ask a question of the passage and say, what is here? And to pause and pray. So as we look at this list, which one is the hardest for you to accept? Which one of these balances, which one of these two polarities is the most difficult for you to hold? I think for me, this idea of casting away stones versus gathering them together is very difficult. I'm one who really likes to see things built. I like ideas to coagulate. I don't like when it comes time to bring things to an end. I like beginnings so much. I like watching things grow. Some people really obsessed with mushrooms. I love mushrooms, but I love eating them and finding them, not so much the process of decomposition. I'm fascinated by it, but I really like the process of growth. And in this respect, I think I would appreciate the seed more than the mycelium, though both, as we're learning from this passage, are an essential part of life. A time to mourn and a time to dance. You know, I think there are a number of different parts of life that we have here, seeking, losing, keeping, casting away, that I don't practice on a regular basis. I don't intentionally keep or cast away very often. I don't intentionally tear and sow. I have learned a lot about keeping silence and then also learning about speaking. And I have come to a point in my life where it's time to speak. That's why these videos, that's why the other trainings that I'm putting together and sharing publicly. A time to love and a time to hate. It's interesting that this is one of the two things that we identify as feeling as opposed to activity. And I wonder if the writer's actually referring to these as a time to have this feeling and a time to have that feeling versus a time to do something. I'd be kind of curious about what he was referring to there. So moving on, from this. So this is this poetic piece. And then we move on. What gain has the worker from his toil? Kind of seems like a surprise until we go back over here, right? The vanity of toil. There is nothing better for a person than that he should eat and drink and find enjoyment in his toil. This is one of the key points. Like, if you're going to learn something from Solomon, learn this. There's nothing better for a person than that he should eat, drink, and find enjoyment in his toil. This is a gift from God. And this poetic section comes right in the middle. What gain has the worker from his toil? So he must, therefore, enjoy it. This is really some interesting advice for our generation, because we have a lot of people who toil for gain rather than for enjoyment. And furthermore, Solomon recognizes that the enjoyment of toil, the enjoyment of our work, our human creation, our effort, our ability to move and do and produce, is a gift from God. It's reframing this away from gain. But what gain has the worker? I have seen the business that God has given to the children of man to be busy with. He has made everything beautiful. Everything. Even all the stuff up here that we don't like is beautiful in its time. It all has a place in our life. Every single thing that is part of it. Our challenge is to learn how to eat, drink, and find enjoyment, to accept this gift of life from God. Also, he has put eternity into man's heart. I think this means that everything, all of time, all of human knowledge, all of existence is in man's heart, but yet it is guarded from us, so that he cannot find out what God has done from the beginning to end. In other words, our experience of the world is limited by time. Even though eternity is in the core of our being, we cannot find it out. It is so much greater than our ability to perceive. Solomon's perception is that there is nothing better for them, for humanity, than to be joyful and to do good as long as they live. Interesting. There's no doing good, there's no being joyful up here. This is all introducing this notion of cycles. And so, in response, how do we respond to this recognition that life is a cycle? There is an in-breath followed by an out-breath. There is birth followed by death. Well, let us be joyful. Let us do good. Let us enjoy what we do as long as we live. Also, that everyone should eat and drink and take pleasure in all his toil. This is God's gift to man. What is God's gift to man? If you were in Sunday school, the answer would be Jesus. And as we are, let's take a look at that name, because Jesus is a derivative of the word Joshua. And if we look at it in Hebrew, we're actually using the name pronunciation of Yeshua. The meaning of that name comes from the word salvation. And the first time you see the word salvation, which you know if you've seen a couple of these other videos, is in the book of Exodus. The book of Exodus, at the crossing of the Red Sea, when the armies of Egypt are coming after the people who are running away from the slavery they had experienced there for hundreds of years. Moses said, "Fear not, stand firm, see the salvation of the Lord." They are going to be saved. This is what Jesus does. He saves humanity. From what? He gives us the gift of God. He helps us to access life and life abundantly. He is the way to the Father. There is the opening of the path back to Eden, where there was work, there was pleasure, there was joy, there was delight. Solomon gets this overarching grand narrative of the human story. And if we can understand this, we can understand part of where we sit in history. Having that gate opened, and yet, for most of us in the Western Church, being unwilling to walk through because we fear this word right here. If we enjoy it, we have been told, it must not be good. Solomon, on the other hand, says, if we enjoy it, we are experiencing God's gift to man. Eat, drink, take pleasure in toil. I perceived that whatever God does endures forever. So he's seeing something of the story. He's also recognizing he's not seeing the whole story. Nothing can be added to it, nor anything taken from it. God has done it so that people fear before him. That which is already has been, and that which is to be already has been, and God seeks what has been driven away. Solomon is not a linear thinker here. If you would have introduced him to the theory of human evolution, he would have probably mocked it and found all of the problems with it. Right now, we're just looking from a philosophical perspective. Evolution is a very Western theory. It begins bad and it ends good. It begins with chaos and disorder, it moves toward order and functionality. That's not what Solomon is seeing when he looks at the grand story of the world that God does. He perceives that it is already. Nothing can be added to it, cannot be improved, cannot also be deproved. It cannot be destroyed. It can be torn, it can be sown, but all of these things do nothing to it. That which is and is unchanging. And what we see now is what has been seen before. And, well, let's see. This is not where he goes into it, but he's like, you know what? Nobody's going to remember the things that are happening right now. God has made it this way so that people fear before him. We must understand that life is outside of our control. Our ability to be joyful and do good is not outside of our control. We get to choose these things. We get to choose how we enter into this cyclical process, this mystery of life. We don't get to choose what the mystery of life is, how it is structured. We don't get to become God. This idea of people fearing before him. Recognize that God has done it. We can do nothing to it. We have no power over the cycles. The cycles are going to happen. However, we do have choice about how we are going to respond. Now let's take a look. A little bit more of his perspective. So this is the God-given task. This is the big frame, the big picture, and let's move in. It looks like he's going to narrow in just a little bit more. Moreover, I saw under the sun that in the place of justice, so in the place of government, in the courts, even there was wickedness. Even in the legal system, and in the place of righteousness, probably in the temple, even there was wickedness. I said in my heart, and by heart he didn't mean just like his feelings. Heart means the core of his being. This is something that he knows. He'd probably say something like to his bones, God will judge the righteous and the wicked. Ha! Here we're back to the balance. We look at the opposite, the righteous and the wicked. Both of them are set to the standard of God. For there is a time for every matter and for every work, the good, the evil, the just, and the unjust. I said in my heart with regard to the children of man that God is testing them, that they may see that they themselves are but beasts. I think this part of what Solomon's saying here I like a little bit less, because I don't like to think of humanity as beasts. But let's see his explanation. For what happens to the children of man and what happens to the beast is the same. As one dies, so dies the other. They all have the same breath. And man has no advantage over the beast, for all is vanity. All is but a breath. All go to one place. All are from the dust, and to dust all return. So basically, who are we as human beings thinking we're so great, we're so much over top of this story? We like to think that we are gods, that we get to shape the world in our own image. And yet, Solomon, this wise man, is perceiving there's nothing better for humanity to do than be joyful and do good. Eat, drink, and take pleasure in toil. This is his advice to humanity. It's not go to the temple every day. It's not build grand palaces and big houses. Maybe, this guy was the great architect of Jerusalem. He built all of these incredible buildings, gardens. He achieved every human achievement, and this is his chapter 2, is saying that he has achieved every human achievement that we all somehow, for some reason, long for. But the gift from God is not all of that. It's the ability to eat your food and enjoy it. Because life is vanity. We're here and we're gone. We're just as good as the animals. They're here, they're gone. We don't think too much about their life and worry every day that a horse or a dog or a squirrel is going to accomplish his life purpose. We're just nope. He's got to go find some food. And this is basically all the animals do. They go look for food and come from the dust, return to the dust. All of us go back into the earth. Who knows whether the spirit of man goes upward and the spirit of beast goes down into the earth. There's an interesting polarity, upward and downward. I wonder where upward is. Heavenward, perhaps? Because he doesn't identify going downward is into the earth. And he's also referring to the spirit of man and the spirit of the beast. It's another thing Western ears are not attuned to hear very well. The spirit of the beast and the spirit of man both have spirits. Surprise, surprise. Especially when he's looking at this. All have the same breath. All of us breathe the same air. All of us get our life from the same place. Our life is the spirit. So I saw that there is nothing better than that a man should rejoice in his work, for that is his lot. Who can bring him to see what will be after him? Legacy, anyone? I was having a chat with a guy the other day about the importance of legacy and how he spends so much time concerned with building, preparing, getting ready for the future. Seems like Solomon has a different way of life than the one that is recommended by the retirement planners. I don't know many people who actually live according to this philosophy. I know it's one that I'm trying to take on, one that I'm having a tough time balancing out because there is a time for all of this. There is a time to work really hard and to focus and structure and bring form. There's a time to relax and let go and play and release. There's a time to just be in the flow of this, and then there's a time to create something out of it. For me, I've been driven to create. I say driven. It's not a negative thing. I want to create. This is a joy. This is something that I do because I like it. And I'm sure there are things that you do because you like it. Rejoicing in our work, liking what you do. If you don't like what you do, the big thing from this passage is, why are you wasting your time? It's time to make a change. The things that you get to choose are to be joyful and to do. So who you are, how you are being in the world, and what you are doing while you're here. The rest of it is out of our control. Let us trust it to God. What an interesting passage. Thanks so much for joining me on my study today. and I'll see you again soon.